Good morning. Welcome to our biosecurity fireside chat. I'm Catherine Rhodes. I'm delighted to welcome John Gower as the main participant in this chat. So as with the other sessions, if you'd like to ask a question, if you can put that onto the swap card app and I'll be able to pick those up later. What we'd like to do is be able to say the name of the person who's giving the question. So if you particularly want to remain anonymous, just flag that in the question and I will take notice. So I'm not going to run through John's biography in full. I think he'll pick up on some key points as he introduces himself and the rest of the conversation. Starting point is going to be sort of looking into the history of biological weapons and biological weapons policy within the UK. And John, you're welcome to kick off.
Thank you very much. I couldn't think of, good morning everyone, I couldn't think of anything less like a fireside chat than sitting on a stage with UV and strong lighting into you that you can't see the people you're chatting with and no crackling of a warm fire. So I think we'll set the fireside chat out. This is a presentation. I intend to talk for about 25 minutes and then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. And then I go into office hours next door, so if you really want to delve deep into this or any other subject, you've got another 30 minutes with me. I'm going to talk about, as Catherine said, history of CBRN policy in the UK, a little bit about the current biological risk space or threat space, what is the UK's current policy and where is it perhaps going in the future after the pandemic. I'm going to look at the convergence and opportunities with nuclear policy in looking at that forward, and then some challenges of emerging tech. And I hope that those topics will give you enough to ask some questions. I wanted to just expand, as Catherine indicated, on my bio, which you are free to read, because it doesn't really concentrate on how I got into this in the early days. I joined the Navy in 1978, which I know is old history to most people here, well before your parents were probably born for some of you. And I went to Salford University and joined the Officer Training Corps because I was told to join something military. And I was sent off to be the unit's NBC instructor, which was a torrid weekend course in very cold Northumberland. And I got to see how the infantry, how the army planned to deal with with chemical and biological weapons attacks in Germany during the Cold War, which really underlined the sense and sensibility of me joining the Navy. So I then went back to the surface Navy and saw how surface ships dealt with a threat, which was essentially to shut the ship down in a citadel, pressurized citadel, and then run a thing called a pre-wet system, which was like a salt spray over the whole ship, so the contaminant would land and be washed away and you could get on with life. And so my simple sailor brain said, oh, there's a better idea than that. If I join submarines, you're in the biggest pre-wet system on the planet by being underwater and you don't have to worry about chemical and biological contaminants. And so I joined submarines and thought no more of it for about 20 years until I was appointed as the head of CBRN policy in 2008. And I held that in 2 jobs for 6 years. So I had to pay attention. And that's why I have my biological cufflinks on tonight. I'm going to talk first about the history of the UK. And it's important to remember that the UK, actually, its history is not blameless in biological weapons. We were one of the first countries to employ them with smallpox blankets and other things that we did that we really shouldn't be thinking about now. And during the Second World War in particular, despite having signed the Geneva Protocol, we were one of many nations that explored offensive bioweapons. The use of, including a test as is well known, of anthrax spores on Grenade Island off northwest Scotland, which left it contaminated until it was cleaned up in 1990. We also manufactured 5 million linseed oil cattle cakes with a hole bored in them ready to fill them with anthrax. The idea was you drop them on Germany using specialty containers holding 400 cakes in a project known, I'm assured, not ironically, as Operation Vegetarian. It was intended that the disease would destroy the Nazi beef and dairy herds as a response to an attack using anthrax or biological weapons by Germany in the war. Obviously, it was never taken forward. But we continued our offensive weapons development into the 1950s with tests of plague, brucellosis, tularemia, and later equine encephalomyelitis and vaccinia viruses as a relatively safe simulant for smallpox. And we did a number of trials in the late 40s and 50s, not around the English coast, but around the Scottish coast off Stornoway and in the Caribbean off our, some of the islands that we then owned, so to speak. And there was one in 1952 off Stornoway where the pneumonic plague bacilli cloud was released over the sea. They didn't clear the range, and a trawler called the Corella steamed through the cloud unknowingly. It was kept under covert observation until the incubation period had finished. No one fell ill. That was the level of the responsibility that was going on. However, in the mid-50s, the UK decided to completely change and renounce the use of biological and chemical weapons ahead of the conventions. And it's worth remembering that the UK was the first country to propose a biological weapons convention in 1969. Later that year, President Nixon unilaterally declared that America would follow suit, but it wasn't until 1971 when the Soviet Union agreed to a separate biological weapons treaty that the BTWC negotiations started, and it was ratified, and the convention banning biological weapons and toxins in late 74, ratified by most countries in 75. And at that point, the biological focus of Porton Down and other facilities turned wholly to defense against bioweapons. And this became even more important when it became very clear that certain signatories of the BTWC signed the treaty and then just continued their bioweapons programs secretly and covertly. Some of them still do today. And other countries continue to hover at best on the grey edge between legitimate biological research and gain-of-function programs using human and agricultural pathogens. So as important as the BWC, as it's now known, most people have dropped the T for some reason, it did not end biological weapons activities. The largest state bioweapons program during this time was that of the Soviet Union, although we didn't know it publicly at this time. We were aware of it in intelligence communities. But between the early 70s and early 90s, it expanded its existing program and amassed the largest stockpile in history, included up to 65,000 employees across military and civilian components in dozens of facilities. In just one facility in Stepnogorsk in Kazakhstan, it was capable of producing around 300 metric tons of anthrax in about 10 months once mobilized. That's sufficient for about 90% of the human population. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, significant assets for its bio program were located in these newly independent states, including Kazakhstan. And it became a serious proliferation concern, and that was the genesis of the Nunn-Lugar program, the cooperative threat reduction which runs today, which spent a great deal of money and time in securing and removing these sites. And some of you may know a senior CSR fellow, Andy Webber, who I think has spoken to the EA community. He was very much a daring-do, forward-stepping State Department operator at that time, and prominent in all, and there's many photographs of him carrying highly dangerous stuff. I personally believe he's waiting for Tom Cruise to finish the Mission Impossible franchise and play him in a biopic of his life, focusing on the daring do in Kazakh and the other stans. Watch this space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current biothreat space. As I've said, the weaponization of disease is not new to human history. Several drivers are at play, whether it's a state or a non-state actor, weaponizing biological agents for motivations ranging from personal avarice to apocalyptic ideologies. And most recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic showed severe vulnerabilities in our threat responses and preparation. Even before this pandemic, the strains and security dilemmas may have been motivating further biological weapons activities. And in some ways, the constraints of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty have perhaps pushed some malign countries in the direction of bioweapons, which are cheaper and easier to hide. Added to these factors are the dramatic technological increases, advances in the last 15 years in particular, that are driving incredible benefits to humanity. We see them every day in the news, but also allow for far more accurate and less difficult manipulation of the building blocks of life. While biological weapons are a long-standing threat, most of us in the expert field believe that the threat is worsening from either inadvertent or malign diversion or accident of biotech. And so in the US biostrategy, which is a really good compendium for this, and most people categorize the threat or the risk areas into 3 areas: naturally occurring, accidental, or deliberate threats. Obviously, there is a whole range of naturally occurring zoonotic threats. It affects people, animals, agriculture, the environment, the biosphere in its totality. And it's important, therefore, to address these threats in what's called a One Health approach that recognizes these interconnections and not necessarily the supremacy of the human in the problem. And obviously, these diseases, wherever they come from, do not respect borders. Urbanization, climate change, and habitat encroachment are accelerating the risks of some of these. And novel infectious diseases and the resurgence or spread of once geographically limited infectious disease and zoonotic disease can overwhelm our current response capacities and make outbreaks harder to control. In the accidental sphere, the risk of laboratory accidents is increasing with the rise of the number of laboratories around the world conducting high-risk life sciences research, and I'll return to that. While this research is important for developing countermeasures, laboratories with insufficient biocontainment or biosecurity protocols or practices exacerbate the risk of an outbreak. And even if you've got the best kit and the best protocols, there's still mechanical or human failure that could cause an accidental release. And finally, as I've sort of covered already, the deliberate biological threats from nations that have continued to pursue these weapons, either because they're not signatories to the BWC or because they're just simply ignoring it. It's important to look, I mean, I was responsible for all weapons of mass destruction countering policy, nuclear, chemical, and biological, as well as radiological for 6 years. And it's important to look at the way in which biological threats sit in the nuclear sphere and what is particularly different about biological. I used to say to people when I was trying to fight for resource for biological preparation, which is the poor cousin in most, particularly in NATO, of nuclear and chemical. If you wanted money in the intelligence community or anything else, if you were a nuclear-based problem, you'd get your money, you'd get your intelligence source, you'd get the resources. A little bit more for chemical, a little bit less for chemical, virtually zero for bio, until the pandemic. I suspect it's changed a bit since then. But I used to say chemical weapons and nuclear weapons would keep me awake in the daytime. Biological weapons kept me awake at night. And why is that? Well, largely the existential differences. If I'd suffered a chemical or a nuclear attack, I pretty much knew where it was. I could draw a circle around it. It was a pretty horrible circle inside it, but I'd generally draw a circle around it, contain it, and deal with that consequence, or at least know that I couldn't deal with the consequence, but that was where it was. Not so with biological threats. Multiple spring-ups, the delay between them arriving and them being seen, the absolute impossibility, largely, unless you catch someone red-handed doing it, in determining the origin, attributing the source of it, and what is your response. Extremely difficult to counter in the same way. And a fundamentally different treaty structure. The nuclear treaty and the chemical treaty both have a body, the IAEA and the OPCW, who monitor it, have a verification regime, and it's very well organized. It doesn't work completely, but it's really effective in suppressing proliferation, and none of that has occurred with the bio, and I'll come on to that. Because the Bio Convention has tried to look at verification. It's tried to look at a process that looks a bit like chemical and nuclear. But because biology, in the way that nuclear and chemical don't to the same extent, offers massive industrial or economic potential for countries who don't have oil, who don't have big manufacturing, but may have some clever people who can do biotech, there has been no consensus of a need to have a verification or a regulatory process. The last time the BWC considered properly the technical feasibility of verifying compliance was in 1993, or it started in 93. Then there was no computers really that people used, certainly no mobile phones. The final report was typed on a typewriter. There was no internet, very few websites, just the DARPA ones. and mobile phones weighed a ton. There was no big data, no applied machine learning, and it predated GPS. The Chemical Weapons Convention was being finalized as VERIX began its work. Our understanding then of the life sciences and biotech was very different now. By the time that process concluded, we had just discovered the first gene associated with Alzheimer's, and it was considered a big thing that you could make a worm glow, which you can now do, I think, at high school level with the right kit. Without a meaningful verification and thus implicit regulatory regime, the risks of either malign intent or unfettered enthusiasm in the biotech sector producing a new pathogen through gain-of-function research is high. And in many ways, and I think this is a particularly key message for this group, there are strong parallels, in my view, between the state of the biotech sector and the state of the AI sector today. And both are energetic and new industries at the cusp of accelerating change, where the people who are in those industries are way ahead of governments in their understanding of what they are, where they can go and what the speed is. And the regulatory authorities are way behind even a concept of what they're doing. They both need collaborative and incentivized, in my mind, cooperative regulation, self-regulation, as a means of identifying perhaps harmful boundaries which research and enthusiasm should bounce back of in a collaborative and self-regulating way, because it's extremely difficult to regulate separately. I don't want to extend this comparison too far because it doesn't really hold water all the way. But in the sphere of regulation versus innovation, I think there's enough common ground for the expert communities on both to consult and advise governments in a similar way. And I think that's an area where the EA community could give some leadership. So I'm now going to spend about 5-6 minutes talking about UK policy. That's all right. That didn't happen in 1993 because mobile phones were the size of a brick and didn't make noises. UK policy, for most of my career, it was largely about countermeasures for troops. How do you support troops going into the European battlefield and allow them to fight through a chemical and biological weapons fog? And that was down to basically rubber masks, rubber suits, rubber boots, and rubber gloves, and plenty of them, and the protocols for changing them in and out. So there are some vulnerabilities in that. There was very little focus on population protection, of course, at the time. And the PHE and its predecessors were concentrating on things like foot and mouth outbreaks, avian flu, H5N1, as they came, not as a coordinated response. So UK first articulated a biosecurity policy in 2018. It's still extant, but it's been under review for at least 18 months now. It's called the UK Biological Security Strategy. I'm afraid, as the COVID-19 pandemic exposed rather brutally, while this part, I will say I left the Ministry of Defence in 2014, I was not part of this policy, it articulated the challenges very well, but it was wildly optimistic about the degree in which Her Majesty's Government departments were ready individually and collectively to respond. There was little prior planning for cross-departmental integration, no stockpiling of PPE, ad hoc civil-military partnership, which led to the very quick idea to build the Nightingale hospitals and then not use them largely. And the list of shortcomings is well known, even with post-event political obfuscation, and it's no means restricted to the UK. The US and the UK have separately completely revised their biosecurity strategies. The US completed and published theirs last year. The UK is still under review. I suspect the sort of carousel approach we've had to prime ministers over the last 12 months has contributed to this, because as prime ministers change, so do their advisors and priorities. So agreeing a strategy has been challenging because it requires a significant uplift in resource to make any difference. The advice that the Council on Strategic Risk that I work with gave to the US government is for 10 by 10, which was $10 billion every year for 10 years to start reversing the problems in the US, which sounds like an awful lot of money, but it's less than half of 1% of the $19 trillion that the COVID pandemic cost the US economy. So in spend to save terms, it's really good. Informal contacts that I've had prior to coming here, once I was asked to speak, I had hoped that the thing would be published so I could analyze it for you. But informal contacts have shown that they're pretty positive that it has had a change. It is going in the right direction. But what I can tell you is what advice a couple of think tanks, CSR and the Centre for Long-Term Resilience, put into the policy, which I hope to see to mark their homework when it comes out. I will point to a seminal advice publication that CSR published in late 2021 called The Handbook for Ending Catastrophic Biological Risks. You can find it on the CSR website. If you really want to have a link, send me a message and I'll link it to you. It takes into account the response to the COVID pandemic and made very clear recommendations to the US government, many of which are in their strategy. Not everything is appropriate for the UK, obviously. But it did analyse that breakthroughs in both the public and private sectors, some of them accelerated by COVID-19, have led to the development of robust capabilities in biological detection, analysis and warning systems. On the deliberate threat side, we at CSR call a strategic vision of deterrence by denial. I'll come back to what we mean by that. On the natural side, it's pandemic prevention, or stopping outbreaks before they grow to pandemic scale, rather than seeking at huge cost to mitigate the damages of that scale. The key point in this dual strategy is that the capabilities and preparations for either one of them mutually support the other one. So you're not looking at it as a defense problem on the one hand and a public health problem on the other hand. You're trying to deal with all three of the threats with a single series of responses. In June of 21, the Centre for Long-Term Resilience here in Whitehall in London advocated the setup of a national centre for biosecurity and a biosecurity leadership council within government. It was advocated in detail with the Future of Humanities Institute in Oxford, which I know has a great linkage with the EA community. And it set the following four objectives: preventing and countering the threat of biological weapons, importantly treating them as comparable threats, I would say greater in my mind, but comparable threats to the challenge of nuclear and chemical weapons, developing effective defences to those threats, bringing horizon technologies to technical readiness, promoting responsible biotechnology development and developing talent and collaboration across the UK biosecurity community. To bring this vision of addressing them to the UK, resources should be focused on four key areas. Firstly, allowing the military-focused agencies like the UK MOD to do more than focus narrowly on biological threats to soldiers in the field. Secondly, to pivot from strategies that really rely on a response, i.e. risk management, to ones that move to risk prevention of the risk across the entire spectrum. It's much more cost-effective and impactful than waiting for it to hit the fan and then try and clear up the mess. Third, focusing on capacity building with allies and partners, because the borders thing is irrelevant when it comes to biological threats. And, as I said I would come back to, addressing deliberate biological threats recentered on deterrence by denial. And if you deny the effect of the weapon, and there is also a response to the use of a weapon by a state or non-state actor, if the effect is minimal and there is a risk of response, then the value of that weapon is reduced. And I'll come back to why that is really important at the end. Second big part of it is lab security. One such activity that is a problem here is the rapid growth of high containment research labs that are conducting research on the world's most dangerous pathogens. The expansion is largely happening in the support of biodefense and public health, but our recent analysis indicates that the proliferation of BSL-4 labs in particular is a potent driver of nation suspicions that others are conducting weapons activities. Further, these high containment labs, as well as many life science activities, as I've said, lack a verified or monitored standardized approach to biosafety, a set of standards and practices that provide practitioners with the tools to handle pathogens safely and in a contained fashion. In some cases, governments do not even have a clear, centralized understanding of what research is being done inside their own borders on dangerous pathogens, much less of what is being conducted outside borders. And the final concern is the publication of materials that may be misused. In the chemical weapons area, a chap called Barzanin published all about the Novichok chemical agents, the fourth generation agents that were used in the Skripal attack in Salisbury in 2018. In the NATO community, we were not allowed to reference this book, even though it was available on Amazon, but because it contained the formulae for you to make these substances. He did it to expose the Russian secret program. We didn't refer to it because we didn't want people to actually buy the book and produce these chemical compounds. So while scientific progress always relies on open sharing of research, there has to be a limit in pathogenic research as to what you make public, because the risks greatly outweighs potential benefit. So the regulations for laboratories need a comprehensive definition of what a good laboratory means, policy for the screening and surveillance of workers, like the nuclear workers do for their radiation dose, to see if worker health is an indicator of whether it's a good lab or not, and the proper registration of all DNA synthesis machines so that an end-user certificate, rather like weapons, can be maintained on all of these. I said I'd come back to the benefit of this deterrence by denial approach. Currently, in the nuclear regime, the UK, US, and NATO nuclear policies have caveats to what are called the negative security assurances, which are assurances that nuclear-armed states give to non-nuclear armed states about the circumstances when they would not use nuclear weapons against them. They have huge caveats in them, and as I alluded to in my nuclear risk talk yesterday, there is a great range of things that particularly the US publicly states it will use nuclear weapons in response. And at the moment, chemical or biological attack is in that list. Setting aside the considerable, I would say insurmountable challenges in verification and attribution of where the attack has come from, I have termed this kind of response as strategic laziness. You may quote and use that without copyright. Broadening the range of nuclear responses to other threats simply because you haven't bothered to invest in a bespoke strategy to deal with that threat is illogical and, you would say, verges on the irresponsible. So a holistic approach to both preparation response to zoonotic and malign biothreats to deter the latter by denial is both necessary and responsible, and would be a step in the necessary progress in the nuclear weapon realm towards a declaration of sole purpose, that nuclear weapons exist only to deter other nuclear weapons. This shift alone would reduce the risk of nuclear use through miscalculation and reduce the salience of nuclear weapon threats in other areas. The final point I want to make in the last 2 minutes is about the added challenges of emerging tech on the biosecurity area. In late last year, CSR published a co-authored report by Natasha Bergema and I, funded by the German government and in collaboration with the European Leadership Network, examining the effect of emerging technology, social media, deepfakes, machine learning, AI, amongst others, on nuclear decision-making in crisis. It is, I would say this because I co-wrote it, a comprehensive examination of the likely effects of these new techs to compress, confuse, skew the awareness and decision-making timelines. It also examined the fundamental place that cognitive biases play in such moments of stress decisions. Though the report is focused on nuclear decision-making, I'm convinced the issues play across all areas of risk. We advocate strongly in the report for more training and awareness of the information communities, briefers and decision makers to understand the inevitable dangers of these incendiary accelerators and distorters of the decision space. And I believe a similar need exists in all areas of existential risk, and further, that each area of existential risk cannot be considered in isolation. So although this talk is about biosecurity and biorisks, I've gone into the nuclear and chemical and come out of them again. I could have talked equally at length about the effects of climate change and habitation change. As these technologies become more capable and pervasive, the number of stresses upon what was already a challenging area are growing. So that's 28.5 minutes of my 30 I said I'd talk about. Thank you for listening. I look forward to exploring any of the issues further, or anything else you want to talk about, in the time left for Q&A and in the office time which follows next door immediately afterwards. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, John. While I wait for more questions to come through, one thing that we said quite early on was that the UK had played a leading role in the Biological Weapons Convention coming about in the first place. And I wondered, and it probably follows on from some of the recommendations made by CLTR, but what could the UK do now to sort of establish leadership in international biosecurity?
On its own, I'm challenged by the UK having a leadership role now because we were not forefront in getting COVID right. So it's rather challenging to have a leadership role when the most recent challenge was probably got wrong worse, and politically so. So I think my response to that would be it is time to, where I talk about collaboration with other countries and bringing novel ideas to dealing with the solutions, that the UK has a role to do that in the fora that it operates, in the UN, in NATO, I would say, in Europe, but we've sort of backed out from that rather stupidly. But in Europe, but not through the EU. That would be my answer. I think it would be a little wrong for the UK to say we have a leadership role. I know the current Prime Minister does use that in many areas, but I think a certain degree of humility in getting our own house in order with the new strategy first would be the way forward, personally.
Thank you. So we've got a question in from James Aung, who's asking about the good first initial career steps for someone who's interested in reducing biological risks.
Well, as I said, in my career, I had no intention, once I went into submarines, of having anything to do with biological risks ever again, and that's the unintended consequence law, is that I ended up doing it for 6 years. So I didn't really have a career path plan that had this. I sort of refer to what I said perhaps in the nuclear thing, and Adam Thompson said earlier in his talk about great power traction, is that if you want to influence these risks, you've either got to be a technical expert high up in the diplomatic world or in the political world to make a real difference. So I'm very happy to have an offline discussion on the detail of it, but I don't think I'm a very good careers advisor for biotech, other than one of those three areas, is become really good at the technical and expertise side so that you advise, or become adequately good at that and get into a place in government or in government advice where you're having traction.
Thank you. We've got a question from Greg Sadler, which again sort of picks up on the things you were mentioning earlier, but about technology advancements and particularly how they might fit into what's referred to as the democratization of technology and may create, in this case, a pathogen that causes global harm. But I think more it's the fact that a lot of these trends are going towards transformative potential being in the hands of a wide range of non-state actors. Is this something worth worrying about? And what is there that can be done about it?
Well, I think it's worth worrying about more in the biosector than any of the other threat sectors that I've talked about, because, and which is why I draw the parallels with AI in my head, because it is extremely difficult to sit in your garage and build a nuclear weapon. It is challenging to build chemical weapons without, you can do it at great risk to yourself. If you want to follow Barzanin's book and build a fourth-generation nerve agent in your kitchen, it is entirely physically possible. The chance of you surviving that experimental stage to move on to something is virtually zero. Whereas that's not the same with biotech today. And sort of garage biotech is a term, but it's genuinely true. If you have the right machinery, the amount of space and the amount of personal risk that's involved is relatively low. So I think it is a concern, and it should be a concern. I also think it is impossible to regulate in the way that the nuclear and the chemical conventions regulate, as I said in my remarks, because actually it's not enduring. You can be doing perfectly legitimate bio work for 98% of the time. You could deviate for 10% of your day, do a bit of really bad stuff, and then come back to and the traces of that can be erased. They're not easy to find unless the inspection regime was there at the moment you did the bad thing. It doesn't have the same hardware or trace issues that the other two do. So I think invasive OPCW or IAEA style regulation is just not going to work. And so it has to be a collaborative and cooperative with the industry. That'll never rule out the mal factor, but as we've seen with OPCW, you can't stop Syria using chemical weapons against its people without a proper deterrence by denial, which we did not have at the time. So it is an area, and so that's what kept me awake at night about biological threats, is that they are really difficult to nail down and to see occurring. And that's why we haven't had a proper verification regime, because states parties cannot agree to it.
And in a way, you may also have answered the next question, which is from Michael Hinge, which is to do with why discovering a country has a nuclear weapons program would lead to public disclosure and a heavy response from NATO and the West, but there would not be a similar response on the case of secret biological weapons programs, or the question whether that's the case or not. But
well, of course, if you have only discovered it through intelligence gathering, it's always not been a good plan. Well, until relatively recently, things have changed. I mean, relatively recently, things that were highly secret and things that I had to sign my life away never to talk about, suddenly they're on the newspaper because, we weren't allowed to mention Novichok or fourth-generation agents, and this was 4 years after I'd retired, and I was under a lifetime ban of talking about Balzanin's books, fourth-generation agents, even talking about them, and then suddenly Theresa May stands up in Parliament and says, this is Novichok, and I'm, holy shit. So there are decisions to change what is classified and what isn't classified, but largely speaking, you seek to protect the secret source of why you found out. But I think the tide on that is changing, not through a 22-year-old airman in the Air National Guard putting on a Discord server, but through a government deciding to the benefit of making clear that country A or non-state actor B is pursuing this program outweighs the risk of showing him that you know. But there are still things out there that are happening that are not made public, largely because there's no response yet sorted. So it doesn't serve an end state to have that.
And I think one of the things, so I went to the session yesterday on strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention, and they pointed out that recently Russia has made allegations, which, very spurious, but there's also, again, this feeling of where do we go with things like misinformation and disinformation?
Well, this is part of the new, it's an element of the new tech thing that I covered at the end. I mean, they're not fairly spurious, let's be clear. It's absolutely pure misinformation by Russia, who are looking at the laboratories that are supported under the Nunluga CTR program in the former Soviet state of Ukraine, and alleging that those are being used for gain-of-function biological weapons research. Now, the purpose of Putin and his team saying that is clearly, in my mind, to manure the ground for use of weapons of mass disruption or destruction within Ukraine. Now, it is continued to be hoped that we continue to deter him against using a nuclear weapon, despite his nuclear saber rattling. But in Chechnya and in Georgia, he used chemical weapons. And in his own country, he's used fentanyls and others in the theatre siege. There is no compunction against using these weapons, and part of the misinformation campaign in Ukraine is, I have no doubt, to prepare for this is why we've used chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine, because clearly that's what they were doing in this facility. It's not fairly spurious, it's complete and utter rubbish. It's ludicrous.
We've got another couple of questions from James Young. I think the first one's I'll start with is to do with why did chemical weapons non-proliferation historically end up getting more attention and funding than bioweapons non-proliferation?
Why did they or why didn't they?
Why did chemical weapons get the more attention?
Well, because there were more of them. Chemical weapons are actually far easier to use on the battlefield than biological weapons. So in the preparations for the first phase of my career, which was the Cold War, and the nastiest bit of the Cold War in the 80s, there was an absolute assumption that chemical weapons would be used on both sides before the signing of the Chemical Weapons Convention, but even then, probably after it. And You can be very much more focused in time and space. You can have durable or non-durable weapons, persistent or non-persistent. It can have a short tactical objective or a large strategic objective where it sits around for months. And so because the threat was deemed to be more realistic, because you can control and manage chemical weapons in a battlefield sense, they always got more funding to detect and prevent and decontaminate, simply because you could make the case that they were more likely to be met. In fact, the threat was probably individually as high, but population-wise lower from a chemical attack, because you can avoid it, you can prepare against it if you've got the right kit. Biological weapons, much more fuzzy-edged. But it just wasn't deemed sexy enough in the battle for money and the prime battle for a Cold War and a superpower standoff that was defined by nuclear weapons, by ownership of, and up to 65,000 of the bloody things at the height of the madness in the 70s, was always going to fund nuclear weapons. I used to get reports even as late as 2012 from people in the depths of the intelligence community telling me that Russian warhead X had gone from 50 kilotons to 55 kilotons, and I would write back saying, please stop sending me the reports. Tell me whether it's going to work or not. That's all I'm interested in. And can we divert the resource into chemical and biological weapons? But it's very difficult to stop a process that started with this absolute focus on nuclear weapons.
Okay, I'm going to join together a couple of questions. So one is quite broad from Quentin Mott, which is, on the whole, in your opinion, do the benefits of biological research outweigh the risks? And then a more specific but related one from James was, how optimistic are you about defensive biotech getting us into a situation where we can completely technologically prevent pandemics?
So the first part of the question, I absolutely would say yes, the benefits outweigh the risks, provided there is some form of management of those risks. You can't just let it go. And this is where I think that my comparison with AI slightly falls apart, but simply because of my lack of knowledge of AI. I'm not able to say whether the benefits of AI outweigh the risks, but I'm absolutely certain, looking at human health, agricultural health, mitigation of inevitable effects of climate change that are already happening or about to happen through biotech is a given positive. So I'm in no doubt that good biotech research really outweighs the risk of bad biotech, but that doesn't mean you can ignore the risk. Sorry, can you remind me of the second part?
So the second question was to do with sort of almost, can you outpace the sort of with defensive biotechnology some of those risks? So the question was particularly if it would get us to a situation where we can prevent pandemics.
No. I mean, the snake oil salesman of defense expenditure will always tell you that their bit of kit will solve the problem that you've got for it. But in my 36 years in the military, that's been proven to be wrong on every single occasion. And I've never seen a defense problem solved by a bit of defense kit. It can be mitigated, it can be reduced, but it's never solved. And usually 6 or 7 other problems come up. Missile defense is a classic example. Missile defense is, the SDI Star Wars shield is going to solve all the problems. The US will be invulnerable, but invulnerability is really dangerous because mutually assured vulnerability is as important as mutually assured destruction in the Cold War. So the answer is that you're never going to have a solution through defense expenditure that completely mitigates the risk. And in fact, it's possibly dangerous to think that you would do so. But the important point I was trying to make is that, particularly in the US, the very high level of defense dollars spent on these threats should have a spin-off and benefit to population control more generally. And the COVID-19 was a classic example of that, where in the beginning, the DoD, as it sits in all its budgetary constraint from Congress, was not allowed to expend congressionally allocated money or congressionally allocated stockpiles of defense PPE, for instance, on non-defense stuff. And it was only, quite a reasonable way into the pandemic when that shackle was released. And I think that kind of isolationism doesn't work.
And another question is from Richard Williamson. Could you speak in more detail on the key elements of deterrence by denial? And then what are the most impactful policy changes or countermeasures that could reduce the attractiveness of developing an engineered infectious disease?
Well, it is a great challenge deterring the use of a biological weapon, or indeed to a certain extent a chemical weapon. It failed in Syria. Drawing red lines don't help, particularly if you then don't act on the red lines that you've drawn. So you have to, so deterrence by denial is, so classical deterrence in the nuclear deterrence sphere is deterrence by punishment. So you say, I will deter you, if you do this, I'm going to schwack you back. Clearly, when responsible nations sign the BTWC and the CWC, schwacking back with biological and chemical weapons, we'd taken off the table. And so our strategic laziness was to say, well, we'll just schwack you back with nuclear weapons. So it's not credible. I mean, it's policy, but it's not credible. So you have to say, well, what is it that's going to affect the... Deterrence is all about affecting the decision calculus of the person who's thinking about using a weapon, particularly these weapons of mass effect. And why would he or she make the decision to do that? If they're a non-state actor with, sarin attack on the Tokyo Underground, almost impossible to deter a whack job organization like that. I mean, don't get me wrong, impossible to deter by denial or anything else. Their decision calculus is not based on anything you can rationally deter. But hopefully you can, with other processes, in terms of the regulation of your industry, prevent them getting hold of the kit in the first place or be aware of it if you do. In terms of the state actor making a decision, he or she will only make a decision to take the risk and all the blowback that comes from it, whether it be economic sanctions, personal problems, or war, if they achieve what they seek to achieve through terror, disruption, death, and destruction. If you can reduce the level of terror, disruption, death, and destruction by having a good reserve of policy and capability and detection that says, I'll detect it early, I'll get a vaccine early, I'll protect my population, you may kill several hundred people, but not the several 100,000 you're seeking, then the cost-benefit analysis in his or her head will change. And it's a woolly concept. There's nothing here that's given. But it is in itself much more credible than I'll schwack you back with a nuclear weapon when you don't know who to schwack back. And would anything reach the level where you would break the nuclear taboo and start possibly a nuclear exchange based on a miscalculation? I mean, look at Wuhan. People still have ideas about how this started. Was it deliberate? Was it accidental? Is it naturally occurring? Under the doctrine of, we will schwack you back with a nuclear weapon, and I'm sure it was discussed somewhere in Washington, there should have been a nuclear weapon going to China. Well, that's problematic for a whole host of reasons. So it didn't, thankfully, happen. But it's far more credible to have a deterrence by denial strategy that reduces the effect. And the primary reason for doing that is it also gives you the capability to deal with a zoonotic effect that is nobody's fault. And so it's a double win, and it's the same money you're spending. So it's really, and there are very few no-brainers in this area, but for me it is a no-brainer.
And then there's a question from Friederike Grosser-Holtz. If you had to estimate what's the most likely to happen in the next decade, so accident, malicious intent, or a natural pandemic that threatens the stability of civilization, so something worse than COVID?
I think I would place deliberate at the bottom of those three. I don't think that risk has gone away, but I think it sits at the bottom. I am not sufficiently scientifically clever to put the other two in order. I think the risk of accident or intermittent malign use of biotech is pretty high without the kind of regulatory progress that I've discussed. But I also think the rapidly changing climatic and habitation issues around global warming and the climate changes face us with a future of zoonotic risk that is much higher and accelerating. And so if you really nailed my feet to the floor and said which, I would say it's a zoonotic out of uncontrolled or unmanaged climate change. But I wouldn't lay money on those two. Does that answer the question? Yes. Yeah.
Cool. And from Eva Siegman, this actually goes back to deterrence. I'm sorry, I didn't spot it in the right order. So again, touching on deterrence by denial, or could you elaborate on whether a similar dangerous race dynamic as were expected from missile defence and deterrence by denial in the nuclear sphere could be expected in regard to biological weapons?
Well, there is a significant difference between missile defence as a denial metric and the kind of denial metric that I'm talking about in the biological sphere. Because the denial metric in the biological sphere is to deny the effect of the whole range of threats that are faced. One of them is the deliberate one, but it also, as I've said, is complementary and it gives you capability in the other two. The purposes of the missile shield in the Strategic Defence Initiative was to gain advantage in a bipolar conflict. If I can survive your attack, I can attack you with impunity, was the implied risk. So it wasn't really deterrence by denial, although some people have called it that. It was, in fact, a genuine poke in the eye with a very sharp stick. And, in fact, those of you who remember when President Putin allowed over-the-shoulder shot of someone showing the transoceanic torpedo, the Poseidon, which is designed to go from one side of the Pacific over to the western coast of the US with a targeting accuracy of somewhere between Seattle and San Diego, with a Technicolor multi-megaton yawn over the city that ends up. The design of that goes way back to classified programs that I was read into with suitable long life, never talk about them, until they were on the TV. And the design of that goes back to the announcement by the US of Star Wars. So the Soviets said, well, if they're going to be able to shoot down all of our ICBMs, we need to get nuclear weapons into the US to continue some kind of threat deterrence relationship. So the unintended consequences of that was that they developed, and hypersonic weapons, which they're now firing into Ukraine, the research into that came off the back of the incredibly stupid idea to pursue missile defense in that sort of shield, Star Wars shield idea that so excited President Reagan.
I've noticed we are coming close to the end of the session. Do you have any key points you'd like to leave as take-homes for the audience?
Well, not really. I've sort of given all my key points. If you've forgotten them, then watch the recording. I will say, though, that I think there is great scope for this community, and I particularly highlighted on the parallels with AI, but for this community to get involved in the thorny and difficult question about how do you get your level of keen compatriots in the biotech industries who are starry-eyed with we can cure cancer and Alzheimer's and solve, I don't know, whatever it is, that's the focus. That's why the young people want to get into it. Very few young people, and I suspect nobody here, because they'd be effective but not altruists, are going into it to be bad on this. But how do they regulate? How do they achieve this ability to do it for the good and not for the bad? And I don't think government has the answer to this because, frankly, as with AI, as I said in my remarks, government is way behind the industries and the people who are really thinking about this, and they're most likely you guys. So they need to be led by people like you.
Great. Well, thank you again, John.
Thank you. My pleasure.